Representative Ilhan Omar looked dead into the eyes of the Vice President of the United States and labeled him a fraud. The woman whom Congress had formally excised from the Foreign Affairs Committee for anti-Semitic remarks, the politician who had infamously reduced the visceral tragedy of 3,000 American deaths to a casual wave of the hand by stating that some people did something, now sat entrenched directly across from J.D. Vance, explicitly telling him that he possessed absolutely no moral authority to lecture her on the realities of poverty. She had absolutely no idea what he had brought with him into that chamber. The Congressional hearing room was suffocatingly full, a standing room-only spectacle charged with the kind of static electricity that precedes a violent storm, with a phalanx of broadcast cameras mounted steady and unblinking along the back wall. Ilhan Omar arrived precisely the way she always arrived, with her chin tilted high in defiance, a meticulously organized binder placed squarely on the polished mahogany table, and a dedicated aide hovering exactly 2 steps behind her carrying a secondary binder in reserve. She leaned forward, adjusted the slender neck of the microphone with practiced ease, flashed a calculated smile at the press gallery, and positioned her smartphone deliberately beside her binder. The screen was tilted upward, the recording application open, ready to capture and clip for the voracious social media machine that had built her national profile. J.D. Vance was already seated, waiting in a stillness that felt entirely disconnected from the circus around him. He had no oversized binder, no hovering aide, and no secondary chair arranged behind him for backup. There was only a thin, unassuming stack of printed pages placed face down and perfectly squared in front of him, resembling a small deck of cards waiting to be dealt. He had not reached for his microphone, had not offered a solitary glance toward the packed gallery, and had barely moved a single muscle since the moment he took his seat. Omar straightened the lapels of her jacket, her voice projecting through the amplification system and instantly filling the cavernous room. "With all due respect, Mr. Vice President," she began, the tone laced with a rehearsed condescension, "I did not come here today to be lectured on poverty by a man who turned the suffering of Appalachia into a lucrative book deal." The camera shutters erupted into a frantic clicking as the entire gallery physically leaned forward to catch the blow. Vance did not move, nor did he offer a defensive smile. He simply reached out and turned over the very first page of his stack. "Congresswoman," his voice was level, entirely unhurried, and devoid of the performative outrage that usually echoed in these halls. "Do you remember the Safari restaurant?" Omar's fingers, which had been resting confidently on the edge of her open binder, suddenly stopped moving. "I am familiar with many restaurants in my district, Mr. Vice President," she replied, a slight defensive edge creeping into her cadence. "I am sure you are," Vance countered, his eyes locked onto the printed text in front of him. "But you did not just eat at this particular one. You went on Somali television, broadcasting to your constituents, and you thanked the Safari restaurant by name, saying, and I am reading directly from the translated transcript here, that you were very thankful for Safari for being part of those places where food is being given out each day, and that Safari gives out 2,300 family and kids meals." He finally looked up, his gaze locking onto hers with the weight of a descending gavel. "The owner of that exact restaurant is a convicted federal criminal, Congresswoman, convicted in the largest, most sweeping nutrition fraud case in American history, where $250 million were stolen directly from a federal program that was exclusively supposed to put food on plates in front of starving children." The gallery shifted collectively, emitting not a gasp but the distinct rustling sound of dozens of reporters and political operatives instantly recalculating the trajectory of the entire hearing. Omar's carefully constructed smile dropped just enough to reveal the tension tightening her jawline as her hand moved instinctively toward her smartphone, offering a quick glance down at the glowing screen to silently check whether this devastating exchange was currently broadcasting live to her millions of followers. It was. She forced herself to lean forward, placing both hands flat on the table and keeping her back rigidly straight to silently reclaim her physical territory. This was her district, her community, and her turf. "Mr. Vice President," she fired back, her voice rising to meet the challenge, "the Safari restaurant was just one distribution site among hundreds operating during an unprecedented global pandemic, and I thanked community organizations across the entirety of my district who bravely stepped up to feed hungry children in a time of crisis. I thanked churches, mosques, food banks, and local grocery stores, And are you seriously sitting there suggesting that every single public official who has ever publicly thanked a community organization is now suddenly and personally responsible for the hidden actions of criminals? She did not afford him the space to answer, pressing her counterattack with the rhythm of a practiced debater. Let me be abundantly clear for the record that the people who committed this heinous fraud were caught. 70 individuals were indicted, severe federal sentences were handed down. And the Department of Justice did its job perfectly, so the justice system worked exactly as it is supposed to. She pointed a rigid finger directly at him across the divide, stating that she did not steal a single solitary dollar from that nutrition program, and that she absolutely would not sit there and apologize for recognizing the frontline people who ostensibly showed up when the children in her district were terrified and going to bed hungry. The room held its collective breath, suspended in the gravity of her defense, which was a formidable counter rooted in undeniable facts that her team had clearly prepped her for, since she had indeed authored a bill intended to feed children during a catastrophic pandemic and was never charged or formally implicated by the Department of Justice. Vance nodded slowly with the specific kind of nod that communicates he heard every single word and was not even close to being finished. "You are absolutely right, Congresswoman. You did not steal the money," he stated, allowing that concession to sit in the heavy air of the chamber for a fleeting second before dropping the anvil. "But you built the exact door they walked right through." Omar's chin lifted sharply as she demanded he excuse himself, but Vance ignored the interruption and turned over a fresh page, his index finger landing heavily on a line highlighted in bright yellow ink. "Your Meals Act, you wrote it, and you personally inserted it into the family's first Coronavirus Response Act, specifically removing the federal requirement to verify that children were actually physically present when the meals were being served. It permitted for-profit restaurants to suddenly tap into a federal nutrition program that was historically and strictly designed only for schools, creating a grab-and-go distribution model with absolutely no built-in mechanism to ever confirm whether a single actual child ate a single actual meal. Omar interjected with exasperation that the bill saved countless lives, and she was not questioning the intent behind it. But Vance shot back seamlessly that he was questioning the architecture. He looked directly at her, ensuring she felt the full weight of the contrast he was about to draw, explaining that before her bill was passed, someone actually had to prove the hungry children were in the room. But after her bill was passed, they just had to say they were. The people who systematically stole $250 million set up dozens of sophisticated shell companies using the exact specific regulatory flexibilities that her legislation created, not some other random loophole written by someone else, but her. Omar's jaw tightened visibly as she countered that it was emergency legislation passed when schools were completely shut down and millions of families were desperately hungry. Vance finished the sentiment for her, stating that he grew up hungry and was not sitting there questioning whether vulnerable children needed to eat, but asking a very simple, direct question about why her specific bill made it completely impossible to check whether they actually did. Omar fired back without missing a beat that you cannot possibly run a flawless, bureaucratic verification system in the dead middle of a once-in-a-century pandemic, when schools are bolted shut and families cannot even leave their homes. Vance did not blink, his composure terrifyingly absolute, as he informed her that other states ran verification, utilizing the exact same federal program, and somehow managed to meticulously track exactly where the meals went, but Minnesota could not. Omar bristled, gripping the edges of the table, and warned him not to put Minnesota's systemic failures on her shoulders, to which Vance shook his head slightly and clarified that he was not putting Minnesota's failures on her, but her bill's failures on her, because the shell companies that siphoned this money were legally registered, using the exact eligibility rules she personally authored, walking directly through the door she built without her putting a lock on it. Omar's mouth snapped shut and her fingers pressed so hard into the polished tabletop that her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white, while the gallery went entirely quiet, descending into the specific kind of profound silence that only occurs when hundreds of people simultaneously arrive at the exact same devastating mathematical conclusion. Omar reached for her water glass, took a measured sip to buy a fraction of a second, and set the glass down just a fraction harder than she needed to, the sharp clink echoing through the microphones. Vance did not raise his voice, maintaining that disarming, relentless atmospheric pressure, as he continued that the part he kept coming back to was not simply the flawed legislation, because laws have flaws and he understands that, but the television appearance. He held up the printed transcript page for the cameras to see, pointing out that she did not just vote for this program or sponsor it in committee, but went on camera speaking fluent Somali directly to her own community, to personally and publicly endorse the specific restaurant that was operating as the central hub of the entire criminal fraud network. He set the page down with a deliberate, audible slap against the table, noting that the 2,300 meals a day she proudly stated on television was the exact same number. Safari was simultaneously claiming on their fraudulent federal invoices, and a federal jury definitively proved that those meals never existed. Omar cut in rapidly, desperate to regain the narrative high ground by claiming she was told those numbers directly by the operators on the ground. But Vance did not yield an inch, stating she was told and willingly repeated them on camera to her vulnerable community without doing a single shred of basic checking. He relentlessly pressed forward, stating the food never arrived, the children never ate, and the money simply left. Omar's hand instinctively drifted toward her phone once more, but this time she did not dare look at the screen, pushing the device an inch to the side in a subconscious need to occupy her hands and bleed off the adrenaline. She stated her community was served during the worst crisis in modern history, to which Vance met her gaze and coldly replied that the restaurant served fake invoices. A single, abrupt laugh barked from the back of the press gallery, the kind of involuntary sound that slips out of a reporter's throat before they can stifle it. And then absolute silence returned. A senior staffer seated directly behind Omar shifted uncomfortably, dropping her eyes firmly to her own lap, while Vance settled back slightly into his leather chair, the posture of a man entirely in control of the timeline. He noted she thanked them by name, on camera, in her own language, to her own people, leaving only two options. Either she intimately knew exactly what they were doing and corruptly endorsed them anyway, or she had absolutely no idea and recklessly endorsed them without checking, and he folded his hands neatly on the table to ask which one it was. Omar's eyes narrowed into slits of pure fury, declaring she would not sit there and have her personal integrity questioned by a man who had spent his entire political career performing poverty for the flashing cameras. Vance's voice remained an immovable slab of granite in a swirling storm, clarifying he was not questioning her integrity but literally reading her a transcript of her own words in her own voice on her own camera. Omar stopped, her jaw shifting slightly to the side as she looked back at her aide for a lifeline, but the aide kept her eyes glued to her lap, and the massive, heavily tabbed binder sitting in front of Omar remained completely untouched. Whatever extensive opposition research her staff had loaded into that folder for this highly publicized hearing, absolutely none of it covered this specific, surgical angle of attack. She finally managed to argue that the restaurant was part of a much broader community effort providing real meals, lacking her initial venom, and Vance responded instantly that this broader community effort stole $250 million from starving children, emphasizing this was not his partisan conclusion, but exactly what a unanimous federal jury found. Omar said absolutely nothing, the room not needing her to, as Vance turned over the next page of his thin stack, noting they were going to move on because the restaurant was not the only place the stolen federal money traveled, and some of it went a lot closer to home. Omar's jaw locked into place like a steel trap, her oversized binder remaining closed, without a single prepared attack line fired. She had strutted into this hearing room with a smartphone propped up for viral victory and a pre-written punchline sharp enough to trend. But now the smile was gone, the phone screen was dark, and the scripted line she had come to deliver was entirely forgotten by the gallery. Vance was only on page 2, and what the majority of the public watching this unfold at home missed was that this entire confrontation was never truly about one corrupt restaurant, but a masterclass in exposing the architecture of political power. Ilhan Omar did not physically steal the money, but she intentionally designed the unlit hallway and drafted the exact legislation that removed the heavy deadbolts off every single door, so 250 million taxpayer dollars could seamlessly walk right through. She merely drew the structural blueprint and left her undeniable legislative fingerprints on the handles, and the dark, unregulated hallway she built did not just abruptly end at the Safari restaurant, it led somewhere much closer and deeply familial. Omar's shoulders rose a fraction of an inch, the subtle physiological shift of someone realizing the next part of the interrogation is going to be infinitely worse. Vance slowly turned the page, deliberately choosing not to read from it, and looked directly into her eyes, noting she had stated publicly many times that she came to this country as a destitute refugee, lived in a harrowing camp in Kenya, and intimately knew the agonizing pangs of hunger long before knowing a single word of English. Omar's chin lifted with a spark of original defiance, claiming this deeply cultivated political ground as her own, confirming she was born in war-torn Mogadishu, fled a brutal civil war at 4 years old, and spent 4 grueling years surviving in a refugee camp before being given the miraculous chance to come to this country. Her cadence steadied into the polished orator, stating she built everything with her own hands and spent her career relentlessly fighting for marginalized people who look exactly like the terrified little girl she used to be, warning him that when he questions where her money goes, he needs to truly understand exactly who he is talking to. The gallery held its breath at the raw, unpolished grit of her delivery, but Vance nodded slowly with genuine recognition, stating he believed the horrifying conditions of the camp and the trauma of the war were real, with absolutely no interest in diminishing her past suffering. He let that profound moment of unexpected empathy sit in the dead air of the room, disarming her defense before striking the vital nerve, stating he did need to ask her about her husband's political consulting firm. Her jaw instantly reset into a block of cement as Vance named E Street Group, run by her husband Tim Minette, noting her political war chest paid that specific firm nearly $3 million during her re-election campaign, miraculously providing almost 80% of its total corporate revenue. Omar dripped with condescension, arguing every single political campaign hires outside consultants for digital advertising and fundraising support, and the Federal Election Commission thoroughly reviewed her filings and found absolutely no legal violation. She pointed a commanding finger back at him, reminding him his own Senate campaign spent millions on outside consulting and questioning if they should audit every member of Congress who hired a firm run by someone they know, sparking a ripple of supportive energy through her side of the gallery. Vance did not dismiss her defense. He dismantled it, agreeing campaigns, hire firms, and the FEC reviewed her filings, clarifying he was not accusing her of technically breaking federal campaign finance law, but asking a completely different question. Omar's tapping fingers went deathly still as Vance detailed how her campaign began aggressively paying Tim Minette's firm while he was still legally married to another woman, whose ex-wife stated under oath he was having a clandestine affair with Omar, while her campaign paid his company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Vance continued that she then married him, and his firm, which barely existed on paper before working for her, miraculously skyrocketed to nearly $3 million in revenue in a single election cycle, with nearly 80% of the revenue coming from exactly one client. Omar shot back defensively that consulting firms secure anchor clients all the time, and there is absolutely nothing unusual about that business model, to which Vance cut through the noise with surgical precision, stating there is something extraordinarily unusual about secretly marrying your anchor client. Omar's open palm slammed against the mahogany table, the crack echoing like a gunshot, as she declared she would not have her marriage disgustingly used as a partisan political weapon. Vance did not flinch, his mask of cold calm remaining as he stated he was not using her marriage as a weapon, her own donors were, because every single dollar they sacrificed was given to elect Ilhan Omar, not to miraculously land in the personal bank account of the man sharing her bed. He clarified this was a financial receipt, not a political attack, prompting Omar's voice to drop into a register of pure ice as she defended the firm's services and her decisive electoral victory. Vance agreed the results speak for themselves, as do the FEC filings showing line items for digital consulting, fundraising, mail production, and literature so frequent they barely fit on a page, noting her husband's firm was paid for everything short of writing her public speeches and casting a shadow of genuine disgust as he suggested maybe he billed for that too. The entire room tightened into a suffocating quiet as Omar squared her shoulders, refusing to break eye contact and insisting the firm provided real, measurable services. Vance turned another page, acknowledging she won, but pointing out she only abruptly cut all financial ties with his firm after the final votes were safely counted and the seat was totally secure, ignoring the initial ethics complaints and press questions, even writing one last massive 6-figure check in the dead window before her noble public announcement. Omar said absolutely nothing, her hand twitching toward her unopened binder before stopping, realizing whatever defensive page she desperately needed had never been written. Vance seamlessly transitioned to the lingering question of her personal net worth. noting her 2023 Congressional financial disclosure listed her household net worth at approximately $51,000, which inexplicably jumped to $30 million exactly 1 year later. He let that staggering number sit suspended in the room before detailing how, after the House Oversight Committee sent an inquiry and the press asked questions, she quietly filed a retroactive amendment, bringing the number back down to under $95,000, casually calling a $29 million discrepancy an accounting error. Omar spat back that her husband's accountants provided incomplete financial information, mistakenly listing gross assets without subtracting liabilities. But Vance did not let her finish the rehearsed spin, emphasizing the sheer size of the $29 million mistake. Omar glared at him, insisting errors happen in complex filings and are corrected, which prompted Vance to lean back and adopt a tone of quiet, working-class resentment. He agreed they happen, but pointed out that the people he grew up with working double shifts cannot make a $29 mistake without the IRS instantly sending a threatening letter, yet she made a $29 million mistake completely unexplained and confidently called it a minor correction. A single heavy breath exhaled from the back of the press gallery as Vance pressed the advantage, noting the House Ethics Committee subsequently opened a formal, bipartisan investigation into those exact disclosures that remains active. Omar attempted to dismiss it as a political witch hunt, but Vance stared her down, noting most witch hunts do not inexplicably involve a $29 million ghost number nobody can logically explain. She sat in silence, abandoning her dark smartphone entirely, knowing absolutely nobody on her staff was ever going to post this part. Vance set the printed page down slowly, reminding her that at the very beginning of this hearing she aggressively called him a fraud. The word landed completely differently now, with the heavy, sickening thud of a finalized bill when you flip it over and realize the devastating total is astronomically higher than remembered. He noted he had not actually answered that accusation yet, but thought now was the appropriate time, causing the entire gallery to physically lean forward and every high-definition camera to burn its red recording light bright. Omar had marched into this room to deliver a devastating viral verdict on J.D. Vance's career, but now she was trapped in a chair about to hear his. The reality missed by the public at home was that the self-proclaimed revolutionary woman who built a lucrative political career screaming about rigged systems had ultimately married directly into one, becoming the very machine she swore to destroy. Vance picked up his entire stack of documents, set them to the side, folded his hands on the empty table, and looked her dead in the eye, shifting the atmospheric pressure in the room as every whispered conversation ceased. He recounted her initial claim that he turned the agonizing poverty of Appalachia into a profitable book deal and allowed her the opening to double down. Omar leaned forward aggressively, proudly standing by her words, her voice building as she accused him of writing a memoir about growing up poor only to shamelessly sell it to the highest bidder, collect exorbitant speaking fees, and join an elite venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. She pointed a trembling finger at his chest, shouting that he came crawling back to Ohio in a tailored suit to tell desperate people he somehow still understood them, while the opioid crisis still kills their children and factories remain closed, declaring him a ruthless opportunist who photographed their generational suffering and sold the glossy prints. The gallery shifted with a sudden, violent kinetic energy, a collective and almost predatory exhalation of triumph erupting from her side of the aisle as the vicious attack landed with the real, devastating, and undeniable weight of a seasoned prosecutor delivering a lethal closing argument in the trial of a lifetime. But amidst the swirling, chaotic vortex of snapping camera shutters, frantically murmuring reporters, and the palpable, suffocating heat of the historically packed congressional hearing room, J.D. Vance sat perfectly, chillingly still, an immovable monolith of absolute terrifying composure who did not defensively reach for his meticulously arranged notes, who did not cast a nervous or seeking glance toward the buzzing press gallery, and who instead looked down at his own quietly folded hands for a long, agonizing, and heavy moment before slowly raising his piercing eyes to stare directly, unflinchingly into the very core of Ilhan Omar's soul. "My mother was a heroin addict, congresswoman," he stated, his voice completely devoid of the cheap, theatrical outrage that so frequently infected these marble halls, yet carrying a raw, tectonic force that caused the entire cavernous room to go instantly, horrifyingly silent, sucking the very oxygen out of the space as he explained with brutal, unvarnished honesty that he had joined the United States Marines simply because he was a desperate, impoverished kid from the forgotten Rust Belt who did not even possess the basic knowledge of how to balance a simple checkbook, that he had deployed to the blood-soaked, unforgiving sands of Iraq solely because that was exactly where the federal government had commanded him to go, and that he had authored a best-selling memoir about the agonizing, generational, and soul-crushing reality of Appalachian poverty, not as some calculated, cynical political brand to be monetized by the wealthy coastal elites, but because absolutely nobody else in his shattered, broken family was left alive, out of prison, or sober enough to actually tell their harrowing story to a nation that had entirely left them behind. He stopped right there, deliberately letting those 4 raw, unvarnished sentences hang in the electrified air, allowing them to carry the crushing, undeniable weight of an entire, difficult human life. Absolutely refusing to list his prestigious Ivy League degrees, refusing to defensively justify his subsequent lucrative corporate career in Silicon Valley, and Omar merely blinked in disoriented, paralyzed shock, as the exact, lethal counterpunch she had spent weeks eagerly rehearsing in front of mirrors entirely failed to materialize in the predictable, partisan manner she had so confidently expected. Vance continued, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet, razor-sharp register that effortlessly commanded the absolute, undivided attention of every single hypersensitive microphone and glowing recording device in the chamber, respectfully acknowledging that she had indeed come to this country as a desperate, traumatized child refugee who intimately and painfully knew the agonizing pangs of true, physical hunger, affirming that they shared that profound, scarring baseline of early, foundational suffering. But he then leaned forward, closing the physical and psychological distance between them, locking his cold eyes with hers, and stated that the fundamental, irreconcilable difference between them was not where they had started their respective agonizing journeys in the dirt and the ash, but rather the undeniable, documented fact that when he finally clawed his bloody way to the absolute zenith of political power in Washington, D.C., he did not deliberately, systematically, and corruptly funnel $3 million of his working-class grassroots donors' hard-earned money directly into his own family's personal bank account under the guise of digital consulting fees. The gallery reacted with absolute, petrified stillness, the exact kind of terrifying, absolute silence that fundamentally signifies a room has collectively picked a side and is never, ever going back to the previous, comfortable narrative, prompting Omar to slam her palms flat onto the polished mahogany table in a desperate, flailing bid to reclaim her rapidly evaporating political authority, her voice trembling with barely suppressed fury as she aggressively demanded that he not dare to compare their lives or their integrity. Vance effortlessly sliced through her manufactured, camera-ready outrage with the surgical precision of a combat veteran, stating plainly and coldly that he was not the one attempting to compare them, but rather he was simply answering her on the exact, treacherous, and highly public battlefield she herself had arrogantly chosen when she initiated the confrontation, set the hostile terms of engagement, and proudly called him a fraud for the flashing cameras and the social media algorithm. Refusing to yield even a single fraction of an inch of moral ground, Vance leaned even further forward, dropping his voice another octave to address a reality so devastating, so historically profound, that it made time itself freeze within the wood-paneled walls of the chamber, pivoting directly to the infamous, permanently scarring moment she had casually reduced the brutal, world-shattering murder of 3,000 innocent Americans on the morning of September 11th to a flippant, dismissive soundbite, stating to her cheering supporters that some people did something. He painted a harrowing, vividly agonizing, and inescapably gruesome picture of that catastrophic Tuesday morning, his heavy words hanging like lead weights in the dead air as he detailed the hard-working, innocent mothers who had gently kissed their sleeping toddlers goodbye, boarded commuter trains, and never called home again. The brave, doomed, and heroic firefighters who had willingly marched up blazing, smoke-filled, collapsing stairwells carrying 80 pounds of gear, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty they would never walk back down to see their families. The terrified office workers trapped in the inferno, who had willingly jumped from the 100th floor of a burning skyscraper because plummeting at terminal velocity to the concrete pavement was somehow the better, less agonizing option, and the desperate, heroic passengers on United Airlines, Flight 93 over the quiet skies of Pennsylvania, who had hastily taken a Democratic vote in the narrow aisles and decided to fight back against armed terrorists with their bare hands because they profoundly understood they were already dead, and the only question left to answer was whether they would die on their knees, begging, or die standing up as Americans. He noted with chilling, barely contained disgust that she had proudly stood behind a safe, comfortable political podium, shielded by the very freedoms those victims died for, and casually described that catastrophic day, a day with a massive, bloody body count and unparalleled, generational, national trauma, like it was a passing, irrelevant paragraph in someone else's distant, dusty history book. And as Omar's breathing grew visibly short, ragged, tight, and panicked, knowing deep in her political bones that every single word she chose to utter next would likely cost her her entire career, her reputation, and her carefully curated legacy, Vance looked directly into the absolute core of her being and stated that he had proudly served in the uniform of the military of the very country that had buried those 3,000 innocent people. He explained, his voice never rising but cutting through the silence like a serrated blade, that he had proudly worn the uniform. He had deployed to the hostile combat zones of Iraq, and he had come home with a service medal, a recurring midnight nightmare, and a solemn, unbreakable promise to himself to spend the rest of his natural life trying to be remotely worthy of the incredible, miraculous second chance this nation had given him when it pulled him out of the trailer park, so when she arrogantly sat across from him in this hallowed room, surrounded by cameras and aides, and sneeringly called him a poverty tourist, she needed to understand one incredibly simple, devastating, and irrefutable fact. He was not visiting. The gallery finally broke under the immense, suffocating, atmospheric pressure, emitting a low, visceral, and deeply human sound that erupted from the chest rather than the hands. The exhausted, emotional sound of a room finally letting go of a crushing, collective weight it had been holding for years, as someone in the very back row openly and unapologetically wiped hot tears from their eyes while Omar sat entirely immobilized, not moving a single muscle, her hands plastered flat to the table with her fingers spread wide, entirely stripped of her meticulously prepared political weapons, her snappy, viral counterattacks, and her impenetrable armor of identity politics. Vance relentlessly pressed his advantage, refusing to offer a lifeline to the drowning Congresswoman, reminding her in a voice devoid of malice, but heavy with the historical record that her own colleagues in the United States Congress had voted to formally, publicly, and humiliatingly remove her from the prestigious Foreign Affairs Committee because 218 elected members of the House of Representatives had deliberately and agonizingly decided that a person who repeatedly called Israel's very existence an act of evil hypnosis, a person who openly and unapologetically compared the United States military to the brutal, oppressive Taliban, was fundamentally and permanently unqualified to represent this nation's complex interests on the global stage. Gathering his scattered, printed pages together with slow, deliberate, and agonizing care, aligning the edges flawlessly against the mahogany, he looked at her one final time on this subject and stated that the specific word she was desperately searching for to describe him was not fraud, but rather mirror, causing Omar's defiant eyes to finally completely drop downward to the table, her rigid, defensive shoulders settling heavily and exhaustedly as Vance turned over his final page and announced that there was exactly one more question left on the docket, the absolute simplest, most essential one he had asked her all day. He noted for the historical record and the millions watching live at home that they were two unlikely, battered refugees from entirely different worlds who had miraculously arrived in rooms of immense, unimaginable, world-shaping power. But the fundamental, defining difference that would echo through history was exactly what they chose to build when they finally walked through those doors. He had meticulously, quietly built an undeniable bipartisan legislative record of service, while she had built a massive, loud, highly aggressive, and incredibly lucrative political platform that completely collapsed upon itself and had absolutely no factual answer when subjected to even the most basic, entry-level legal scrutiny, offering her one final, perilous, and highly calculated chance to speak and defend her rapidly crumbling legacy, Omar played her absolute strongest, most desperate, and highly rehearsed emotional card, her voice temporarily steadying as she loudly declared to the bank of flashing cameras that she is a black, Muslim, immigrant woman whose unique, diverse voice is constantly and unfairly put on trial by the racist, systemic establishment of Washington. She appealed directly, aggressively to the court of public opinion, claiming with maximum theatricality that this grueling, relentless hearing was not a legitimate act of congressional oversight, but a coordinated, vicious campaign of targeted harassment, explicitly accusing the powerful white man sitting across from her of systematically weaponizing his immense institutional power against a marginalized, vulnerable woman who inherently looks completely different than everyone else in the room. Vance waited silently, respectfully, and with infinite patience for the loud, aggressive echoes of her impassioned speech to completely fade from the wood-paneled walls, acknowledging with genuine, disarming sincerity that he believed she had indeed faced real, ugly, and undeniable discrimination in her life. But his voice then echoed with a chilling, lethal, and absolute clarity as he stated that historical discrimination absolutely does not make a legally binding federal subpoena magically disappear into thin air. He ruthlessly and systematically dismantled her ultimate defense mechanism piece by bloody piece, noting with devastating factual precision that she had blatantly ignored formal written invitations to testify under oath from the Minnesota State Legislature, that she had flagrantly missed hard legal deadlines for producing vital office documents regarding the missing funds, and that she had her legal subpoenas actively and corruptly blocked by her own partisan Democratic colleagues in a desperate bid to protect her, all while serious, unyielding House ethics investigations into her millions of dollars in unexplained, overnight wealth remained completely open, active, and unresolved. He counted off 5 separate, distinct, and documented times that legal authorities had politely asked her to walk through a door and simply answer basic questions about where the taxpayers' money went, and every single time that door was slammed closed, bolted, and locked securely from her side, proving beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt that these were not vindictive, right-wing Republicans unfairly targeting a minority woman, but her own deeply frustrated, embarrassed political allies who could not even get her into the room to explain the gaping holes in her story. The gallery went dead, graveyard quiet as her potent identity card and carefully crafted victimhood narrative were entirely, permanently spent and discarded, leaving her completely exposed, isolated, and shivering in an unforgiving wooden chair with absolutely nothing standing between her and the final, inescapable question except a suffocating, heavy, and judgmental silence. Vance slowly picked up the very last piece of paper from his stack, the single sheet that held the entire weight of the hearing, and softly, almost gently, asked the only question that truly mattered in the grand scheme of the universe. Were the children fed? He demanded to know, on the permanent, unalterable congressional record, if the promised, life-saving hot meals actually ever arrived from the massive $250 million government emergency program that her specific, meticulously crafted legislative bill had created, or if the taxpayer-funded food never physically reached the kitchen tables, the school cafeterias, and the empty stomachs it was legally and morally supposed to reach. Omar's mouth opened slightly, hovering in the electrified air for a fraction of a second as if searching for a lie that could save her, and then snapped completely closed, her panicked, terrified eyes darting frantically down to the polished wood of the table as 12 agonizing, excruciating, and historically damning seconds of dead, uninterrupted silence passed, delivering a devastating, undeniable, and entirely permanent confession without a single syllable ever being spoken into her live microphone. Vance did not attempt to fill the awkward void or interrupt her total paralysis, gently stating that if the starving, desperate children were actually fed as she claimed, she should have absolutely no problem enthusiastically throwing open all 5 of those locked doors to proudly show the American people the financial records and clear her tarnished name, but if the massive sums of taxpayer money vanished into fraudulent, untraceable shell companies, luxury real estate, and consulting firms, and the food never actually came to the children who needed it, then someone in that building owed those starving kids a real answer, and she was the one who wrote the law that enabled the theft. The room was entirely, utterly done, settling with a crushing, immovable, and absolute weight as the veteran cameraman in the back row slowly lowered his heavy shoulder rig, having already captured the historic, career-ending image of a paralyzed, terrified congresswoman entirely unable to answer a basic yes or no question about whether the starving children in her own district actually ate a single meal. Vance calmly, methodically, and with martial precision gathered his original 15 sheets of paper, stood up slowly to tower over the table and the broken woman sitting across from him, and reminded her in a voice that carried to the very back of the hall and through the television screens of millions that she had the sheer, unmitigated audacity to call a United States Marine and a man who grew up surviving on government food stamps a fraud, all while her own political campaign quietly and illegally funneled millions of dollars to her husband's newly created firm. Her personal net worth inexplicably jumped $29 million in a single, miraculous year, and she locked the door when federal investigators asked her to explain the financial miracle. He looked at her one last, lingering time, stating definitively and permanently that he did not come to this hearing to call her a fraud, but rather he came to read her the undeniable, documented receipts, leaving her abandoned, useless smartphone sitting dark and lifeless on the table as a monument to her silenced, shattered platform. This explosive, unprecedented hearing was not just about exposing one corrupt, hypocritical politician, but rather a systemic, brutal, and long overdue exposure of a deeply entrenched, rotten, and parasitic Washington machine that masterfully and cynically weaponizes identity politics into an impenetrable suit of armor, ensuring that elite elected officials get staggeringly, obscenely rich while dodging any semblance of accountability, and the exhausted, financially drained working class watching the spectacle at home on their couches knows deep in their weary, calloused bones that this rigged, two-tiered justice system never, ever protects them. They do not get to casually call massive, multi-million-dollar discrepancies, minor accounting errors to the IRS, or have powerful partisan colleagues illegally block federal subpoenas on their behalf to avoid prison time. And they are violently, physically sick of watching the very elite people who write the stringent, suffocating rules blatantly and repeatedly break them without facing a single consequence. Two remarkably different people arrived in this country with absolutely nothing to their names, but one carried a gritty, painful, and undeniable truth into public office, and answered vicious accusations with calm, verified facts, because he had lived the struggle in the dirt, while the other hastily built a hollow, fragile platform of manufactured outrage that got incredibly blurry the exact moment the husband's consulting firm got paid, and the starving children she swore on the Quran to protect became nothing more than obscure, ignored line items on forged corporate invoices. Absolutely nobody gets to sit righteously in front of the television cameras and arrogantly call someone else a fraud when their own damning, million-dollar receipts are still sitting face up on the table for the entire world to see, and the American public desperately needed someone with a microphone, a platform, and a spine of steel to finally say it out loud on national television. The haunting, lingering, and ultimate question that will outlast this viral hearing and echo through the unforgiving halls of history belongs to every single hard-working American paying exorbitant taxes and every exhausted parent blindly trusting the federal government to help the vulnerable. Did the money actually feed a desperate, crying child? Or did it land safely and quietly in an offshore bank account behind a fabricated shell company that served fake invoices instead of hot, nutritious food? The receipts sitting on the table called her a fraud in absolute, undeniable reality, but just as the stern committee chairman finally raised his heavy wooden gavel high into the air to officially dismiss the suffocating, tense room and end the devastating spectacle, the massive, heavy oak doors at the very back of the chamber swung violently and unexpectedly open with a loud, resounding crash, and a breathless, frantic federal investigator wearing a dark trench coat marched straight down the center aisle, his eyes wide with adrenaline and extreme urgency, carrying a single, heavily sealed manila folder containing highly classified documents that neither the vice president nor the stunned, paralyzed congresswoman had ever seen before this exact, terrifying, heart-stopping second.